It's my honor to welcome you to the 18th Sheridan Simon Distinguished Alumni Lecture on Faith in the Future. This series was established to honor and remember Sheridan as the extraordinary teacher and person he was. It was his decision that this is how he wanted to be remembered, by having his students give talks. The series is supported by an endowment funded by his students, colleagues, and alumni, meaning you guys. The fund was established by Jonathan Molino, Rex Edelberger, and Elwood Parker in 1994. And Steve Shapiro was central in encouraging alums to complete the funding of this by 2015. Those of you who attended the first of these lectures 27 years ago, given by Stephen Harvey in 1994, may remember the title of his talk was Faith in the Future, Science, Technology, Culture, and Coping. And here we are in 2021 on Zoom. So he had the right topic. Interestingly enough, today's talk is titled Faith in the Future of Artificial Intelligence. I see a pattern here. I don't know where we'll be in 27 years, but there's a suggestion. We'll be introduced by Don, and as you heard, Don was his professor in classes here at Guilford, and he was his student at classes at FAU. So Don.
All right, thank you. Welcome everyone. And it's such an honor for me to get to introduce Will. Will was in my very first class that I taught at Guilford College, senior level electricity and magnetism. And I really enjoyed getting to know him then. He was, as you'll see, full of energy and ideas. That hasn't changed. And he was really fascinated by how computers could link into what we were doing in the classroom. I actually spoke with another alum just recently, and when I mentioned that Will was going to be giving the talk, this other student said, oh, I remember when Will was our TA for our first year experience class, and he taught us all about how you can have computerized swarms of birds figure problems out. And so and Will has always been interested in how computers and physics intersect with the wider human experience. I also had the pleasure of Will being in the science and religion class that I taught with Eric Mortensen. And we really enjoyed grappling with the big ideas about humanity with those students and Will in particular. And then Will went on to do his senior thesis here on using neural networks to try and predict El Nino weather cycles. So he was actually my first introduction to neural networks and machine learning. And one of the joys, I think one of the biggest joys of being a teacher is when you get to have a professional relationship with your former students. And in this case, Will became my teacher and has taught me more about machine learning. And I'm trying to bring that back to Guilford. And it's been a great reciprocal relationship because Will is now at Florida Atlantic University, a very large school in Boca Raton, Florida. And he has told me that what he's tried to create there is a little Guilford in the middle of this big research university. And I got to go down and spend a week learning about machine learning, working with Will in his lab a summer 2 years ago. And it would strike you immediately, the connections with Guilford, because this was the middle of June, big university campus, hardly anybody there, empty building. I go up to Will's floor and it is buzzing with activity. He's got high school students, undergraduates, graduate students, people studying psychology, computer science, biology, robotics, all buzzing in and out of each other's rooms, collaborating, asking questions, trying to figure things out. It fit right in, and it made me think of Will. So even though he went on to study the brain in a technical sense for his degree, and he's a professor of mathematics now, he's always been a student of the human spirit and a teacher at heart. And so it's my honor to bring him back here to Guilford to tell you about his ideas about education and how we can use the oncoming future of machine learning in that effort. So without further ado, let me turn it over to William Hahn.
Thank you so much, Don. Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you, everybody, for being here and just being part of this amazing community. This is truly one of the great honors of my life to be here and then to present this talk to you. There's so much I'd love to share, so we're just going to kind of jump into our slides here. Okay, can everybody see now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so it's my honor to present the Sheridan Simon series. I'm calling this Faith in the Future of Artificial Intelligence. And so first I want to just talk a little bit about the memories and get that out of the way first. Rex said that everything has to be a clear and positive message. So I don't want to cry at the end of this talk, so we'll get that out of the way first. I actually went back to the Wayback Machine. It's interesting that there was a machine that decided to capture the Guilford internet history, and I found this beautiful picture from 1996 on the archive of Guilford website, and this beautiful quote at the bottom. So I thought we could start with a moment of silence and to remember those who can't be here today. Rex was really the first person I met at Guilford. I was actually sent a postcard in the mail, and we had to pick out the first year experience card, and I had a couple choices, and actually called up some of the registrars, and I chatted with them for a bit, and they were so helpful. And they said, "Hey, Rex sounds cool. Why don't you take his class?" And I took that class. It really changed my life from the first moment I met Rex. I never got to meet Sheridan, but I think about him all the time. And part of the purpose of this talk is to kind of explain what that really means. You know, how is it that I could think about someone I've never met? The culture that Sheridan left behind, we see it today. We see it all over. We see it in these reunions. We see it on the Guilford spirit, and we see it in the spirit that the Guilford alumni carry out into the world. And I think it's extraordinary to kind of witness how much impact that a single individual or a small collection of individuals can really have on this world. And it's really inspiring to me. I had the wonderful opportunity to study abroad with Rex. We got to go to the BMW factory and look at all the engines being made. And it was just so inspiring to see how Rex really cared about a lot of different things, from the architecture in the cathedrals to baked goods to all kinds of different areas, you know, singing and the cultural events in the community. And he was just sort of a big piece of it all. And so he's just sort of a big piece of all of our lives, and we want to remember that. I was shocked. I've actually learned a lot already today about the history of computing at Guilford. I had no idea we had a PDP-11. I think that's extraordinary. It's just amazing history. And that blurb about how at one point, you know, had the real bragging rights of the best computer in North Carolina, I think that's really great. I had some previous experience in programming computers, but when I really got to Guilford, it was when I got to really combine these ideas with mathematics and physics and see, you know, computers are really kind of one of the stars of the show. They can help us do some really spectacular things in physics. And it was really exciting to hear that this was something that Sheridan and Rex pushed for, you know, decades before I showed up on the scene. So I want to talk about, you know, what is Guilford today? What does it look like? And some things I'm really excited about, these opportunities with this new technology. And I kind of wanted to start with this idea of the liberal arts, right? We have this term. It's something we all understand, having been at Guilford, but it's a really interesting and rich concept. And the more I looked into it, I thought, you know, we really need to kind of, I think, embrace this. There was some discussion about this morning. When I think of my experience at Guilford, it really was all of the different sort of variety of experiences I got. Had I been limited to a sort of a purely technical education, I don't think I would, you wouldn't see the slides you're going to see today, right? So what are these classic arts? Well, we've got music, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic. And really, these are the skills I think most you know, Guilfordians try to embrace. We don't have this sort of old-fashioned notion of it anymore, but I think certainly in the physics department, these are the things that I picked up and learned. It was funny, you know, Rex was probably better at grammar than anyone I knew because his English was a second language, and he sort of was very proud of that. He taught us the skill of rhetoric, of how to get up and tell your story. He taught us the skills of dialogue. James's musical performance this morning was unbelievable. And so I think, you know, bringing all these different ideas together, right? That astronomy is a type of art. It's just so fascinating. So what are these things? Well, we've got logic, the art of thinking, grammar, the art of inventing and combining symbols, rhetoric, the art of communication, arithmetic, the theory of number, music, the application of the theory of number, geometry, the theory of space, and astronomy, the application of the theory of space. And so I just love this. I think this is something that we can kind of modernize and extend to the other parts of the Guilford community and curriculum, and kind of reassess this. You know, we're going to get to this. Yeah, I'll come back to that. So, what are these sort of different arts? We sort of have this, multiple cultures we talked about. Unfortunately, and this is even worse on the larger schools, where we sort of say, anybody who wants to do math and numbers, you go to this side of campus. Anybody who cares about humanity and culture, you go to this side of the campus. And I think this is really ridiculous. I think to solve the problems that we're facing in the world right now, we're going to have to start having this rich multimodal thinking. In psychology, so-called synesthesia, the ability to think of numbers and shapes and colors all at the same time. We have to have rich internal experiences so that we can make sense of this. Here's a funny one where they have the liberal arts with the planets and the metals, right? And so you think of, like a periodic table. Imagine if each of these elements had a sort of a personality. Most young people can name all of the characters off of their favorite television show. How is it their brain is able to do that, and yet they have a terrible difficulty memorizing technical details? How do we kind of bring those two areas of the brain together so that we can, do a better job of that? I think this is what Guilford has really done such a great job over the decades and decades it's been around. It's extraordinary to see that in real life as it comes back. So what does Guilford look like today? What are the students that go to Guilford? What are they looking for when they show up? So I found this breakdown of the degrees that are awarded, and they're broken down. These aren't the names that Guilford goes by, because this is a third-party website that's reporting this, and so they're named under different things. So park, recreation, leisure, and fitness, that would be sports management type majors. But as we go around this wheel, we can see this is extraordinary. We have an incredibly rich and diverse set of interests at this college. That, this is really the richness. This is the value of Guilford. We do not want to take the top 3 or 4 wedges and throw the rest away and say, this is what we're going to be now. I think it's this diversity of thinking and diversity of experiences and backgrounds and all of these ideas that makes the experience at Guilford so magical in what it is. I'm putting lots of pictures in here so we can have sort of a virtual tour to reminisce of the campus. As a student, I got to, you sort of forced me. As a student, I was forced to take courses in jazz appreciation, in colonial Latin America, in science and religion, in science through science fiction, in all kinds of different ways that I would have never known that I knew I would be interested in those things. There was a talk earlier about, should students know what they want to do before they go to school? And I don't think so. I think the whole point is that you should have the idea that you're going to learn things you don't know about. I think most high school students have the unfortunate idea that college will be a little more difficult, but it'll be somewhat the same of what they've done before. And the really exciting idea is you're going to learn new things. You're going to learn fundamentally new concepts you never really encountered before. And I think that's really the magic of these different types of students. I was a physics and math major, but my friends weren't. And I had some on this call, and I had so much fun sitting down at the lake in the woods and all, explaining to them what I did. And so I had to explain to an English major or a Spanish major or a sports major or a psychologist or criminal justice what it is that I was working on in the physics department. And that really forced me to kind of understand myself what it was that I was interested in working on. Now, I have the opportunity now to work with a lot of psychologists and on a lot of brain projects, and we try to think, we have this sort of metaphor for left and right brain, and it's probably not cleanly split down the middle, but this is clearly the case. We certainly have different modalities, and unfortunately in the world, we tend to put economic incentivization on the one, and you have to be willing to sort of starve yourself if you want to go in the other direction. And I think this is sort of, we're really suffering on both. We have this on the right here, we have this tower from the liberal arts, but it reminds me sort of this Tower of Babel in a sense, that we really need to bring these ideas together. We have this unfortunate sort of linguistic disintegration now with these academic subjects that, in my opinion, if you just learn, chemicals, but you don't have a foundation in math, and you haven't used the computer, and you don't know the physics principles, and you haven't thought about geology, and you haven't talked to the biologists, well, then why are you studying the chemicals? So there's this whole sort of circle that I think we need to kind of, this interconnected web of, why we want to, study these ideas in the first place. So how did we get here, right? So there used to be one subject, natural philosophy, that was Newton's major, so to speak. Nowadays, even in a small school like Guilford, I was actually very overwhelmed when I went and I looked at all the majors and minors. There's a lot. It's overwhelming. And I think if I were a high school student, I would be terribly overwhelmed by that. I think we need to, and this is much worse at the larger schools. Today, we have specializations like you can be a petroleum engineer or a paleobotanist or this and that and the other. You can have extremely specialized technical areas. And even specializations not in technical areas. And I think we kind of need to start bringing that back together. And the way I try to look at that is to kind of go back to the history of this stuff. The AI is moving very fast, but if we start at the beginning, There's not that much of it. So if we go back to 1850, we can find Alfred Smee. He was trying to put together the theory of electricity. He was basically less than 100 years old at this point. And he said, why don't we apply it to biological systems and see if we can understand them? And I think this is an extraordinary diagram that he had from 1850. And what we see here is his map of how the brain might operate in an abstract sense. And so this here says skin, ear, and eye. And the idea is the signals from the eye go through this little network object, and then they get routed around and they actually get sent to the muscle. This is extraordinarily modern representation. It sort of hardly makes sense. And so here we have from 1850 what a neural network would look like. And here we have sort of what a modern neural network looked like. So we have this sort of terrible difficulty of getting things into the world soon enough. Sigmund Freud actually wrote about neural networks as well, which is interesting. But then it was about the 1950s that people started to build these things. So this one's called the Mark One Perceptron. And so this is a giant contraption. They actually wired this thing together. So it sort of reminds me of the physics analog labs. I've noticed over the years that we all had a tremendous exposure in analog electronics and analog thinking and analog computers. And I found in my career that no one in the world I've ever encountered outside of physics had known any idea about that. And so it's completely missing from what we might call computer science education. I think it's very unfortunate. So this enormous elaborate machine with sort of this spaghetti thing. We can now simulate this, thankfully, and we can get students to do it. Back in the 50s and 60s, they couldn't even solve these Sesame Street type problems. You know, this giant letter C. Still couldn't even do that. And so we've seen an extraordinary kind of the progress in computing machinery. And Guilford was really amazing about this. In the Calc 1 class, Edward Parker was fantastic, and he let me bring Maple and my laptop in on some of the assignments. And I think he was a little surprised by the request, but he let me do that, and that really made an impact on me because I was very excited about learning the mathematics, but I was very excited about these new computing machinery. I think when I showed up to Guilford, I think I was the only one that brought a laptop of all of my friends, which seems kind of wild right now. And so we have Vannevar Var Bush down here with a differential analyzer. Again, something that's sort of completely missing from computer education. It's sort of way too old to be taught in any computer science curriculum. It's way too new to be taught in any history program. And so it's sort of just missing from curriculum all over. And I think these are some of the most important intellectual developments of the last 100 years. A sort of massive, sort of a huge history of these massive analog computers that kind of just fell off the map. And then nowadays we have this miniature stuff we can look at for free. So I think there's some really interesting theoretical, rich kind of science here. You know, we have our classic physicists like von Neumann. They were really excited about going in these directions. I think there's a tremendous opportunity to engage the biology departments. There's a lot of students that you know have these ideas of going to pre-med. I think we can kind of steal them and say, hey, you know, there's medical physics. There's other areas you can go into. And we can bring this out. I'm really fascinated by sort of waking students up to these sort of undocumented history, let's call it. So this is a differential analyzer. This is a water computer, a Soviet era water computer. It was classified for decades. I haven't found anybody's ever heard of one of these. It's another version of that same thing. So this in real time can do very high precision solve differential equations. It wasn't until the mid 80s that digital computers could beat the decimal places on these. Here's another analog computer. This one could simulate the Saturn rocket 50 times a second. I don't know anybody who's even familiar with this kind of thinking, let alone, you know, is trying to do this kind of thing. So then computers got digital, it looks like this. Now this kind of thing fits on your watch. So you've got this tremendous amount of power. It's pretty ridiculous. So Turing came on the scene and he said, well, it's pretty difficult to try to make a fully intelligent machine. Why don't we build a baby machine? Why don't we build something that has a brain and then we can train it just like we know from animal behavior? And so Arthur Samuel, he took this idea at IBM, Bell Labs, and he sort of ran with this. And he set out a machine that could play checkers. And what was really fascinating is when this thing was done, it could beat him at checkers, which is pretty wild. How do you write down a list of rules that will beat you at something? That's essentially, you know, it sounds impossible, but that's the magic of sort of machine learning. The problem with all of this stuff is it gets renamed every few years. So the original name was this from artificial intelligence. John McCarthy came up with that name, and he says in an interview that it was just to sound fancy for a grant. So don't think too heavily into it. There's nothing artificial about it anymore, and there's nothing intelligent about it. It's sort of a misnomer. Machine learning is probably a better name. That showed up in sort of the 80s. These were victims of their own success in that whenever they worked, it became a commercial application, and no one talked about it anymore. Visa and MasterCard have been using these things out to sort credit card applications since the 80s, but they don't tell you how and why they work because they didn't know. It was sort of a black box, and they just were happy that it gave them the predictions they needed. The real breakthrough is deep learning, and there's sort of three components to that. One is the data. We can go out to the internet and get a lot more data. The third thing is loading in the graphics card. So we have a very high-speed parallel, what used to be called a vector parallel supercomputer. We can now get these at very low cost because of the video game industry. And the third real development that I think is sort of missing from the conversation largely is a breakthrough in mathematics. And it's a sort of a mathematics stolen from physical sciences. And this is the idea of gradient descent. And gradient descent is the bread and butter of every area of physical science, from chemistry to physics to astronomy to everything you can imagine. And really deep learning is just this idea of let's use gradient descent to solve math problems. So how do we do that? We take this sort of network object. Alfred Smee gave us these ideas from 1850, so we load that in. We train it with a bunch of existing data sets of cats and dogs. We're going to look at that. And then once we have that model that's trained on some data, we then take it and we put it out into the world. We stick it on a flagpole. We put it out on Guilford Farm. We put it at the lake, and we say, what do you see? What are you counting? And let us know. So the extraordinary thing is just sort of how the miniaturization of this has kind of made this all possible, right? You know, Bradley, you were talking about how, you know, think about how big that PDP-11 was. I'm sure they had it in the administration building, and everybody was just using terminals because these things were enormous. And now everything is just micro miniaturized. It's hard to imagine. I think we need to emphasize to students that these are the products of human ingenuity. But this is easier now than ever. For $5 or $10, you can get your hands on these little computers. These things would have made Turing blush. I mean, and they just cost nothing, right? So we have this 100-year version of Moore's law. We can go back to the original mechanical computers and hand calculations, right? And then we can see there's a PDP-1 on there. We can see there's the Cray supercomputer. There's the IBM. Here's the Power Mac. This is what I worked on with Rex when I showed up. And then this is the computer. This is the computer you can get for free in the cloud now. You know, so that you can kind of make these analogies. If the automobile had done this, you know, it would be cheaper to just throw your car away. You wouldn't even park it. You would never pay a parking ticket. You would just get a new one, that sort of thing. What's really neat is if we go back to the 90s, the National Labs and some of these other folks, here's Hans Moravec, he made these plots and they tried to calculate sort of what is the computational capacity or capabilities of certain organisms. And basically when they ran this plot out, they said that by the year 2020, we were going to start hitting these, you know, the ability to simulate lizards, mouse, monkeys, and so on. So that's kind of the goal of our lab down in Florida is to say, well, if this is true, then we should start. And this is something we should start thinking about doing. And there's a number of very practical reasons to do it. So when I was born, this is the fastest computer in the world, the NASA Ames Digital Wind Tunnel. This was used to design the space shuttle, Cray supercomputer. It was about $32 million. If you compare it to the Raspberry Pi 2, the B, you can get that one for $38, but that's got 512 megabytes of RAM. So to get the Cray, you would need 2 of them. So we're looking at about $32 million. So we've gone down by a factor of million in that price. And so that's just really extraordinary. In 1997, when I was in high school, this was the fastest computer in the world, 1.8 trillion math problems every second. It was 10,000 Pentiums glued together, cost $55 million, and used the power of 800 houses, right? So now we can get into this really green energy. When we talk about deep learning models, we talk about sort of the carbon footprint and all that can go with it. We can now sit our students at these computers for the price of $1,000 or so. You can now have these computers. This particular computer is 10 times faster than the fastest computer in the world from 1997. Right, so now you can get this computer for $100 and then it'll get you on the cloud, no problem. So now we're going to talk about this sort of digital imaging. What do you do with all this high-speed processor? Well, we need to parallel process all these pixels. So this guy, Steve, he worked at Kodak and he went up to his boss in 75 and he said, I've got a new device, electricity. It works on or a new camera, runs on electricity. They said, we make our money off ink and paper. We don't want anything to do with this thing. And so they flat out rejected this thing. As you know, Kodak went out of business. Now, the reason why is because you couldn't store those pictures. We have a hard drive here on the left from 56. That thing wouldn't even store one iPhone picture, not even one. Now we have, when I was at Guilford, you could get this 128 megabytes for $100. Then, now you can get 128 gigabytes, and this is old, right? So now you'd have these sort of half terabyte little drives the size of your fingernail. It's really extraordinary. So what do you do with that? Well, now you can just stick them in your camera. So that's what makes this so much cheaper. So it's 1,000 times better picture, 1,000 times lighter, 1,000 times cheaper. In the 80s or 90s, only an astronomer would have a digital camera, and now everybody has one of these things in your pocket. So what do we do with these things? Well, we do imaging. Imaging takes us from physics to image. Image processing takes us from one image to another image. Computer graphics takes us from the world of symbols to the world of images. And we're going to be interested in the opposite, computer vision, which takes us from the world of images to the world of symbols. So this is the cats. This is what Sarah does such a great job keeping healthy, and we got sort of keep them sorted out. So that's what we can have sort of an AI do that. And so this is sort of the goal. I like to call this the hardest problem in the world, because once you solve this problem, you can solve pretty much any other problem you can think of, is you can sort of make it a version of this problem. Okay, so why is this difficult? So maybe some of you have seen this before. If you have, see if you can remember what it was. If you haven't seen this before, what is it? What are you looking at? And so this is why this problem is difficult for AI. This is to simulate the difficulty that a computer or an algorithm would have looking at some random data. So this looks kind of like maybe the Grand Canyon, or you took an undersea rover off a shelf, off the coast somewhere, or maybe it's a moon survey or something like that. But it turns out it's not any of those. It's a photograph. It's a regular photograph. It's not a 3D photograph. It's the first photograph that I popped up on Google for this search term. Everyone has seen this image or the equivalent of it. But in this form, you can't recognize it. In a second, it'll go into the right angle. Your whole neocortex will sort of snap into place. And you say, oh, wow. And so that's been there the whole time. And so when we say we're looking for a face, or we're looking for a cat or a dog or a tumor or a car wreck or whatever that we're looking for with our smart system, what is it that we mean? Are we looking for these little Grand Canyons? Are we looking for these little shapes? And so we can see the kind of the abstract problem that the computer would have to deal with. And so the success in this has been essentially reverse engineering the visual cortex. That we have this region V1, and that's basically where we're at right now. We've basically reverse engineered this little piece, and it's extraordinary and unreasonable what you can get away with that. What we're working on in the lab is say, all right, well, what's the rest of this do, and how can we sort of both better understand this thing that we are, that's alive and awake and experiencing, and then how can we better understand this so that it can help us, do things in the world like count stars or do medicine. And so what's really neat is these actually serve as models of the brain cells. So this is a computer simulation, and here we see actual data of real neurons, and then we can have these very simple Gabors. So we see that they're looking for these sort of localized wavelets. And once we have those kind of feature extractors, we can then run this on this convolution operation, which convolution is kind of the bread and butter of astronomy and all kinds of other areas of physics. And so it's these basic tools that we're all familiar with going back decades we can use. All right, so why is this exciting? I have tremendous faith about this for the future, because I really do think this is an extraordinary opportunity for the Guilford students, for the Guilford community, and for the world. So what's going to be affected? Everything. In one of my older slides, I had a list of companies that were involved in machine learning. I took it out because it was kind of a joke, and it always was, because this is kind of like having a list of companies that use electricity or companies that have a website. Companies will either use AI or they will go out of business. There will be no middle ground. And not to be harsh, but I think schools will have to teach artificial intelligence, or students will go somewhere where they can learn that. But it appeals to so many different kinds of students, and it's no longer a technical subject. I was watching an interview with Don Knuth, a great programmer, and he said that by 1995, he was tired of email. He said after 20 years, he had gotten so many emails, he was sick of it. Right? So as a computer scientist, he got his email address in 1975. Most of us, most students probably didn't get an email address until they went to Guilford, right? So there's this sort of this early gap. My point being, there was a time where if you weren't a computer scientist, you had no business bothering with electronic mail. This is no longer the case with artificial intelligence. This is no longer a strictly technical computer science major or a programming expert or even a math or technologist. This now goes out into the real world, and as we'll see, this applies to anybody. If you can use your phone camera, you can make some tremendous advances in this field. This also ties in with all these cool flashy stuff that all these kids want to know about, right? Steve, do you remember we were with Rex a few years ago at the barbecue place? I told you all about blockchain. Gosh, we could have saved the school just with that one. Okay, so how are we going to save this? Rex always said you can go out and get some money in physics, and later now that doesn't make sense to us. But as a freshman, I was like, okay, this is a good idea. Good idea, Rex. We can work on this. And so I think we should tell this story to these students, that if they study these subjects and they get a technical major at Guilford, or they come to the Guilford College and they learn how to interact and learn about these technologies, that they can go out and they can get some really great jobs. What's interesting is Marcus here, a lot of these I consider the same thing, right? To me, machine learning engineer, data scientist, big data developer, director of data scientist, those to me are all almost approximations of the same thing. Unity developer is also something that we're working with, which is really kind of cool. So this is really just like the fastest growing area by far. And it's just, we can get across to the students to say, hey, there's an opportunity to get involved and to go do these kinds of things. But what's really neat is the opportunity for Guilford to go and apply this like on campus. We have so many resources, whether it's the chemistry labs, it's the telescopes, it's the farms, it's the lake, it's the people, it's, you know, so many sort of resources that, you know, being at a large school, we got to write a grant to go. You know, if we wanted to go, and earlier today there was a great talk about sailboats, and I was thinking, well, you could do a little mini sailboat race with RC sailboats in the Guilford Lake. You know, that's the kind of thing. Guilford could just do that. You know, Guilford could just do that for $500. They can go get a few little mini sailboats and just set that thing up. A big school like I'm at, you know, it takes a few years to put something like that together. So I think being at the small thing, it really helps to learn this. So this is kind of our metaphor of, you know, how do we build a brain that brings all these things together? But that's what we want to do with Guilford students. We want to give them the ability to not just experience the world in one modality, but to be able to go to a jazz concert, to be able to read a poem, to be able to go and write a creative piece, and to be able to do it. Okay, so now I want to kind of, you know, hit at some of the things that Guilford students look at, and, you know, how we can kind of steer them in these directions, and how this can be sort of a unifying curriculum, I'm hopeful, across the departments. We have a lot of amazing small departments that I think can be combined forces and combined strengths to both have the students overlap in the enrollment, and also to get this great crosstalk amongst these different majors. So maybe we'll get a pre-med student who wants to go and work with the local hospital to get CT data, and then maybe they could partner with a physics student that talks about the radiation dosage, and then they could talk about, you know, a sociology student who talks about the ability for people to get advanced medicine, all kinds of different rich topics. So this is extraordinary how fast this field's moved. We'll just kind of go through this real quickly, that I think this is a really fun area to get people into machine learning. A lot of kids know they want to go to medicine. A lot of these students are driven by what their parents want them to do. I think that was largely the comment about the engineering. Students are told by their parents, hey, you need to be an engineer. And I think a lot of them are told they need to be a doctor. So I think we can say, hey, if you're serious about going into medicine, this is what medicine is going to look like in the next 20 years when you graduate. Right now, there's no reason why we don't go head-to-toe scans for MRI. The only reason is the physician's unwilling to spend that much time looking at your data. You can't really afford, as individuals, we can't afford to pay for the radiologist to spend 6 hours looking at our scan. But the AI can do that, no problem. And so we can go through in every little bit of detail and understand it. And on just a bigger note, on a sort of philosophical thing, what is this thing? You know, how can we better understand this thing that we are? And so that's what we're trying to build a model. We're trying to build something that's not the brain, but hopefully is sort of like it and can help us. And that's why I think we really need this sort of different aspects of the liberal arts. I found that in my own understanding of the brain, thinking about things like music and art. There's pieces of our brain that's the only mode they understand. So I think Guilford, particularly the science departments, have been tremendous at sort of forcing this interdisciplinary, interactive kind of thing. But I think we need to move even past that and start to kind of blur these lines. And this is a real challenge. And I don't envy the administrators who are going to have to think about how we do this. And I'm certainly, you know, willing to help in any way I can. And I know the rest of the alumni are, to kind of put our heads together and think, you know, how do we dissolve these sort of boundaries that I think at this point are getting in the way? So this is really kind of fun. This is just, I'm just going to show kind of all kinds of cool stuff that you can do with these things. This one, let me see if I can switch over to this tab. Can you guys still see it? Can you guys hear that?
Yes.
Okay, so this is a fake song in the style of Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald. The AI was given the lyrics, and this is what came out. Are you smiling just for me? City of stars, are you shining? So you get the idea. You can go listen to that later. You know, if you sent me into the studio and you said, you know, you can't leave until it sounds like Frank Sinatra, I wouldn't be able to come up with that. So I think that's really, really extraordinary. You can check that out. It's called Ai Jukebox. So there's some really kind of extraordinary things that you can do with these systems now. So you train them on looking at the captions of a newspaper. And so you give it the photograph and you say, here's the caption that went with that photograph. And the idea being later you give it a new photograph and it will actually caption that sentence. This is pretty wacky. If you had asked me 20 years ago how you do that, I thought you would need something like C-3PO, data from Star Trek, an android, this like thing that was alive and could talk to you and you could show that thing a photograph and ask questions. These systems are not alive. They are giant Excel spreadsheets. They are big MATLAB programs. They are just made out of numbers. And I think that's really, really encouraging that there's no tortured soul inside of our self-driving cars that is not, doesn't want to drive us around anymore. I joke with the students that if we make the robotic doctors too realistic, then they're going to want to play golf on the weekends. And so we get into some really interesting kind of philosophical questions. But I think what's fascinating is that at the current instantiation, it's very obvious these things are not conscious in any real way or in any way. They're just numbers. But what you can do with them now is really kind of just unbelievable. And so this is some work that just came out where you run this system backwards and you give it a text prompt. And unbelievably, this is the responses you get. So you ask it, I want an emoji of a baby penguin wearing a blue hat, red gloves, green shirt, and yellow pants. And that's what it comes back with. Now that's extraordinary. I'm not an illustrator, I'm not a graphic designer, but now I have a whole new world that's open to me. I could now illustrate a kid's book. I could design cartoons. I could create mascots for a product. So there's all new career options that are available to me. I'm just going to spin through some of these because this is really just kind of extraordinary how this works. And so you can just put in these queries, and you can say, all right, I want it in this style. I want a drawing. I want a charcoal. So if I was an art major, this wouldn't scare me. This would excite me. I think we need to kind of embrace this. We need to run at these things full steam and teach this to the art students and explain to them, all right, now if you're going to paint a painting, maybe you create 57 of them in a virtual space. Do a showing there, find the one people really love, and then you spend 2 months painting that one. Right? It can just do this really ridiculous stuff, like give me a manatee walking a dog wearing pajamas. You say, no, I want it to be a business suit, and it'll sort of just change these things out. You can say, I want an owl in X-ray. It knows what isometric images are. We could say we want a clock, right? It even gets the reflection. So some things aren't perfect, the numbers don't make sense, but it knows that to do glossy reflections. We can ask for a hexagonal green clock, right? It's just like all this just crazy stuff. And so it knows what hexagons, it knows what clocks are. We could say, I want a neon sign with the words OpenAI in it. You can generate entire people that don't exist. I mean, this is going to be sort of a really big issue moving forward. These two people, it might, by coincidence, there might be some people on the planet that happen to look like them, but these two individuals don't actually exist. These people aren't real. But that's really hard for my brain to wrap my head around. It's much easier for me I can think of an imagined name. I can tell you a backstory. I can think about who these people are and tell you a little bit about them. That's easier for my brain to understand a sort of a fake reality than to think these are just pixels that have never been existed and we're sampling from some abstract distribution. Here we have sort of fake celebrities. They sort of look like real celebrities, but they're not real people. And so I think that's just really, really extraordinary. We can do really wacky things. We can turn zebras into horses and horses into zebras. We just take a photograph of piles of photographs of the two different kinds and we'll automatically learn a mapping to switch these back and forth. We can even do this as an animation, which is really kind of wild. But if you notice that the stripes are moving, and so it's not quite perfect yet. We can take a photograph. We can put it on all these different art styles. This is really fun. So I took the Guilford campus there and I took a picture of Cezanne and I put the style on it. So if you're interested in learning how to do this, Don and I are going to do some of these fun things tomorrow in our short course demonstration tutorial. And I just think this is really neat because, I didn't get to spend my time, unfortunately, at Guilford learning to be an artist, and I wish I had. And now I can experience sort of some of this. And at the other side of the coin, now artists can sort of experience the fruits and the joys of physics and do some of these really sophisticated things. Oh, I see Don's got a good one in the background there. That looks like Munich, but Starry Night or something cool. This is a really fun one too that we can play with tomorrow morning. This is called GoGAN. As a joke, these are called Gans, Generative Adversarial Neural Networks. Now the artistic skill on the left is about where I'm at. That's about, as good as I can draw. And now I have these sort of computer assisted ability to create things from my imagination or assisted from my imagination. Here we have it's tremendous, the work that Tom English is doing together, putting together the history. I think this is really fantastic. We have such a rich history at Guilford, and I think it's amazing that we preserve this and digitize it and get it out there. And one of the magic things that we can do with this AI is sort of bring these to life, where we can colorize these old photographs, and it's spectacular because it can just do this in just a few seconds. And it's just really neat. It just helps me, bring this to life and realize these are real people, real Guilford students. So we can take Memorial Hall and sort of jazz that up. And what's really neat is it even got the style of colored images sort of from that, time period in a sense, right? So had that been in other words, it looks like a hand-colored image, is essentially what it looks like. So it's sort of contemporary with the time and the photograph would have been taken. So here we can take a style as well. Let's take the Frank, we'll do it the Starry Night, and then we can sort of make a stylized Frank out of that. We can take an Ansel Adams. So here we take a sketch. So here's like a photography style, and sort of it almost kind of looks like a sketch on the other side. And so now that could be an inspiration. If I'm learning how to sketch, I could make this first and then copy that. And then we can just do all kinds of crazy stuff with this, right? It's really, really extraordinary what you can make with these things. So definitely check out tomorrow if you want to try these things. This one's really fun. This is called Learning How to Paint. Well, let's come back and see that one tomorrow. And so this one's gonna paint for us, and that's really cool. So you have to check that out. I guess that video didn't click through. Let's see if this one will go. Yeah, here's another. Oh, it doesn't like that one either. Okay, so you have to come and check those out tomorrow morning. So that'll be a teaser. So both of these are sort of learning to paint. This one does it as a 3D, and that one does it as a painting. Okay, so what else can we paint with this thing? Well, we can paint all the leaves on a leaf. So I was really excited when I came by a few years ago in Guilford to build a new farm. I think this is a tremendous opportunity. I think this is a huge draw for the next generation of students. I think this is something you can recruit internationally to bring students to this. And it has the opportunity, I think, as a test bed to kind of bring together a lot of these different subjects. Because you've got concepts like sustainability and growth and geology and chemistry and physics and light and photography and everything else you can imagine in sort of one of these things. Over the shutdown, I built a little aquaponics garden in my backyard, and this was 2 days ago. This is our haul of tomatoes out of one pick. And so I decided to build a AI to count my tomatoes. And so this is one that's called the Tektron, and I trained this. I put boxes. I only had to label about 25 images, amazingly. And you put boxes around the tomatoes. It'll learn to ignore the green ones, and then this thing will go through, and you can take a picture, and it will say, all right, here's all your tomatoes. And so now we can do all kinds of spectral analysis. We can find out, is this tomato ready to be picked? Is there something wrong with this tomato? We can look for all these different tomato diseases. I can't memorize all the details of all these tomato diseases, but now I can just have my simple system and say, oh, well, I know what that is. That's this. We can put these on little quadcopters. You can get these kind of little helicopters for just a few $100s now, even less, $40 or something like this. And you can put embedded. So this is actually a little flying GPU, right? This is like one of those Cray supercomputers flying around on a miniature helicopter. It's really extraordinary. And this is really cheap. So you can measure all of this kind of stuff. Now you can really do science on these things, right? You can now measure and say, all right, if you get this treatment, we grew this much. If we get that treatment, we grew this much. we can bring in the chemistry experiments. And so now we have an overlap between the analog electronics and the circuits and the chemistry labs. These components are so inexpensive now. It's extraordinary. For $5 or $10, you can get this one's total dissolved solids. We've got pH, conductivity, oxygen. So I've got these. I'm setting them up in my water garden out back. And so now we can get all this data, and I sort of overlap with all these different things. And so now you can have the physics student calculate how much water is going through and the work and energy. You could have another student talk about the sustainability of how much water is being consumed. You could have the electrical students talk about how much current this is generating to measure. So I just think these are sort of prototypical, like fiercely interdisciplinary projects kind of thing, right? So we can point these things. We can separate fish. I know there's some nice aquariums on the first floor of Frank. You can point these things at that and track all those fish around. You can get this kind of overhead data that you couldn't possibly measure before, which has been too expensive. You'd have to have 1,000 volunteers with clipboards and flash photography and stuff. And it was just way too expensive. There's some been working with black soldier flies. It's really fantastic sustainability. If anybody hasn't seen the soldier flies, definitely take a look at this. I think it's something that could be grown on the farm, and then you can track all of these with the computer vision. It'd be super cool. So you can actually track like the whiskers on these things. It's really unbelievable. The details that you can get. You can track fruit flies. We can track animals. You can put this out into the Guilford woods and see sort of what wildlife you have there. Partnered with the parks in North Carolina, animal studies. Just anything you can possibly imagine. You can now go to, I call these virtual Fitbits, because we can just say, all right, track this, 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 and this, and you put these little markers on there, and now you can just measure all of this stuff. And now, you just couldn't afford to do these kinds of measurements before. And now we can do all kinds of cool statistics and, basic introductory math. We can use these sort of sophisticated tools to introduce sort of the basic ideas, which is really kind of cool. And so it's just extraordinary, just experiments that you couldn't even conceive of not that long ago. And human experiments. So now there's a large psychology department. I had some friends who did some cool psychology experiments there. And so now you can measure this. You can say, how do people reach? How do they interact? What's their social behaviors? You can measure students as they walk across campus and so on. We have a partnership with the Max Planck Institute, and we help them analyze their microscope data. This is something called serial block phase scanning electron microscopy. And this little microtome is going to shave off a couple nanometers of that there. This is the retina of a fruit fly. And then the idea is to map out, what that structure actually looks like. And so this is kind of what that data looks like. On the left, we have the raw data. And so we can see here, we can have the cells, and then we have all the different organelles and things that we're trying to label. And so we have the experts will go through and label the cell boundaries here, but that's very, very painstaking and takes a tremendous amount of time. But the idea is you just do this for a couple stacks, and then we can then train the system to label those then automatically. And now we can go through and we apply this in 3D. You can imagine doing the same algorithms for carving out a galactic spiral. But there we have some dendritic spines, and so we can see the synapse where the two neurons are actually talking to each other. And so this would be the synaptic cleft where your neurotransmitters actually go across. So it's hard to kind of see the neuron graph structure. And so the idea is, how can we take this little block of data, which might be only a millimeter on a side, and really kind of map out that full structure? We don't actually have the wiring diagram, even for something as simple as a fruit fly. So I thought I might as well mention that there was a great talk earlier by the Everscope stuff. And so it was great to collaborate with the guys on some Gans stuff a while back. I think there's some tremendous applications for that, which is super exciting. There's so much, with Perry just right down the road, there's so much opportunity. I was just watching a talk, and some of these new telescopes that are going online, just like Everscope, they said, I think it was the James Webb, and they said they're going to find like 20 million new objects every night. I mean, it's just like, it doesn't even make any sense. Like every night, there's 20 million new things they're going to put into the catalog. Right, so just this idea of, beauty was something that came across at Guilford, this idea of aesthetics and, really looking at the bigger picture, that it's not just about a simple scientific experiment, but we got to kind of look at this aesthetic criteria. I was very inspired by Sheridan's prints that they're in the hallway there. I hope they're still there on the third floor. Maybe we can get those digitized soon and put those online. I did some searching, and I was able to find something. There was this little sort of piece I found where someone was trying to find more about Sheridan. And he had apparently written this thing called the Hoffman Quartet, which I was able to find a PDF, and I'll send that to Don, and we can post that around to put into the archives. And it was really fascinating. So Sheridan created worlds, and as a hobby and as a professional astrophysicist and theorist, he would create these worlds, and he would run the simulations and create computer programs and make sure it worked. And the idea was that he would then hand this off to a science fiction writer who had a ready-made, realistic, backdrop for which them to place their science fiction story. And so I was able to find one of these called Hoffman's Quartet. And it's really spectacular just flipping through it. I'm looking forward to looking through the whole thing. And so I found a piece of that, and I fed it into the transformer. And so I gave the first paragraph out of this document to the neural network, and I asked it to continue the work. And so I hope that Sheridan would approve. And so the first paragraph is a little technical sort of background, so it's not even really the story part that he gets into. And I'll let you kind of read this here. Well, so the part in blue is what Sheridan wrote, and the part in brown there is what the AI put out. And so this was the first thing. I just did one run. I put in that piece, and this is what came out. And I think it's really extraordinary how it's able to kind of fake this technical language. It did get a spelling mistake. If you look down there, see if you can find that. But if you read that, maybe the astronomers in the group can read that over, and it sounds okay. It's not terribly wrong. It's funny. It says the bright orange and blue-green colors can be distinguished by yellow, orange, and my thing's in the way. I can't see here. And red bands. So it doesn't have a memory, so it doesn't know that it just said orange and blue and green. So it's just making up other colors as it goes. And so it's kind of interesting to kind of witness its limitations there. But I just think this is really extraordinary to kind of take these things and feed it in, and how can we seed that in? So I put in a couple other fun quotes that we'll just kind of leave this with here. I put in when I was a student at Guilford College, and the AI responded, and there were no libraries for about a decade. They told me that literature was strictly forbidden. It was going to stop. It made no sense to me. And so I thought that was rather interesting. And then I gave it one more. I said the best part of the reunion was, and it came back with this, when Troy and Bruce first were caught by Laurel and Carly, and they knocked on Bruce's door, and Scott was pouncing as he put on it as the host, you thought a single episode was going to change the course of their lives. And then I liked this part that it put out next. It was really surprising, and I still can't believe it happened to me. But all of a sudden, I started to learn something. So now I'm really, really excited about coming to the CW. It's a lot of fun. There's so much history that really tells us something. And so with that, I just want to thank everyone. I was particularly my mother. Unfortunately, she was going to be here for last year's reunion, but she didn't make it to this year's. I want to thank her for everything that she did to make me who I am today. I want to thank my beautiful wife, Stephanie, and her wonderful family. Without them, I would not be who I am and where I am. I would like to thank my Ph.D. advisor, Elon, who, of course, without him, I wouldn't be the person I am today. I would like to thank Don for his magic work at sort of keeping the tradition alive. This has been a tremendous success in this reunion. I've really enjoyed it so far, and thank you, Don, for keeping this tradition alive. This was the only picture that I got of me at graduation, and so I wanted to put together a bunch of pictures in there, but this is the one I have of me at graduation. So many people I want to thank. I wish I had more time to go through it all. Steve, you gave me a book on neural networks, and I remember typing in those equations directly into MATLAB. That changed my life forever. Tom, your MATLAB course was really fantastic and forced us to think outside the box in terms of problems. Rudy, I'll never forget when you had me give a presentation on parametric equations, and that really gave me a tremendous amount of confidence moving forward in my public speaking skills. Elwood, when you let me use Maple on an exam, that really changed my life and set me forward with computer program. Ben, the chaos class that we had was truly spectacular and set me down the path for dynamical systems. Rob, I'll never forget when you took us into the other room and you had the graphics, the silicon workstations, and you showed us some of the models you're working on. And I wish I had more time at the time to get more involved, but it was such an inspiration. And sometimes just 5 minutes with a student and just a little idea, you might not see, but that idea grows and grows and grows and can really be something extraordinary later. Gail, the chemistry really was just spectacular. And Dave with the glass blowing class really gave me some ideas about simulated annealing, which gave me a passion for gradient descent and some really fun stuff. And so I just want to thank everybody. I want to thank Don again for putting this together. I want to thank the Guilford students, the alumni. The reunion was the best class I had at Guilford, I think. And I want to make sure that we encourage all of the students to come back to these and make it a big part. I want to thank everybody at Guilford, the alumni, and the tremendous work you're doing to keep the college the tremendous place that it is. I want to thank the support that I get down here in South Florida and our tremendous community. Without them, none of this would be possible. Thank you all for your time and attention today. This was truly a great honor of my life.
Thank you.
Happy to please answer questions.
Yeah, one problem with Zoom is we can't do proper applause, but thank you so much. Let's go back to the full screen. I know we can't see everybody, but we can at least see 25 people. So let's see the best way to do this. I think if you click on the reactions button, there should be a button there that says raise hand. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and I believe Zoom will move you up to the top corner where I can see you. I'll call on you, and then you can ask Will a question, and we'll just go from there. So if you have any questions, please just hit raise hand under reactions.
I see an actual hand from Rudy. Maybe we just start there.
Rudy has a question?
I saw an actual hand. Was that a hand? Or maybe just blocking the sun.
Scott has a question.
I was blocking the sun so I could see what Don was talking about. But I don't mind asking while you're at it, is there any chance we are actually living in a computer game? If you toyed with that idea, and can you comment on the possibility?
I think it's a fantastic question. And I really believe this is one of the interesting questions that we can bring in students with, because I've found that this latest generation is really fascinated by this notion. And I think it's a fascinating idea. So just in brief, if we look at the history of computer graphics, from Pong, in the 1970s that Rex would have coded up to, there's computer graphics now that you can't tell it's not real. Like Don Klein's awesome background there in the palm tree. You can't tell if it's computer generated or if it's real nowadays. And kind of part of the idea is that if we take the current Moore's law that we're looking at, that pace of progress, and we go out, say, 100 more years, we will get indistinguishable, right? How will we know? I remember when I was little, there was playing one video game, and I wanted to go to the other side of the lake in the video game. And I thought, how do I get over there? And it was much later that I realized, well, there is no over there. The programmers didn't put it over there. It's just a piece of artwork, right? And so, but now in the real world, when we break open a rock, there's atoms inside, kind of thing. Do we break it open? Is there codes in the inside? I think this is a really interesting area called digital physics. And Stephen Wolfram is actually doing some really fantastic work in the last couple years on some of these new digital physics models. And I think that kind of gets into this. Are we in a simulation? What would that mean? What would the substrate of that simulation look like? But again, I think this is a really interesting idea that I found that the high school students, the younger generation, are very familiar with this simulation hypothesis idea. And I think we can draw them in and say, all right, if we were in a simulation, what can we measure in the physics lab that would test that? What can we measure in the chemistry lab that would test that? What can we measure in the astronomy lab that would test that? And so on. So it's a fun idea for sure.
All right, Scott Field was next, and then Stefan, and then there are a couple of questions in the chat that I'll read out. But let's go to Scott and then Stefan.
So, William and Don, how do we see a path going forward to really have the perception that AI is a domain of liberal arts colleges instead of kind of exclusive to engineering schools and management information programs?
Yeah, I think we have to kind of go back to these roots and point out what these original liberal arts were and kind of say, hey, this is what this new field is. That when we look at these, take the cat and dog scenario, when we actually solve that problem, I believe we really do need all the pieces around that liberal arts wheel. We need the geometry, we need the arithmetic, we need the type of thinking you have in astronomy, the type of thinking you have in grammar, the type of, I think we need all of those. And I think we can make the pitch to this next generation that when they want to go out and solve these real problems, they're going to have multiple skill sets.
And I am starting to teach a machine learning class here that's project-based, and it's a general education class. So it's specifically not aimed at those audiences you just mentioned. And I found when I was putting it together and looking at what's out there, the vast majority of machine learning classes out there are aimed at data scientists, computer scientists, physics. I did not find much that was general education. And so the students that I taught, they did projects on trying to predict sports, to look at medicine, art. Those were the topics they found interesting. And they came up with really neat projects.
Rex used to talk about dessert first.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that we try to emphasize is to get these students involved in this early. They don't have to wait until they're at the end of a technical career. You can start with this material.
All right, Stefan was next, and then I'll do some from the chat, and then we'll go to Toph and then Eve.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. So let me see, I'm trying to think about how to correctly phrase my question here. So we've started doing a lot of this stuff in some of our courses as well at UNC, small like first year seminars and things like that. Here's my take on this, and I want to get your reaction to it. You've presented a really upbeat and forward-looking and optimistic view in your in your presentation, and it's true. I mean, it's fascinating. It's cool. It's like when you see some of this stuff, you say, oh man, I just want to go do that. I don't think, though, it would be very difficult to take probably a lot of your slides and reconstruct them into a series of observations that at the end we would be horrified as opposed to optimistic about machine learning, artificial intelligence. How much time do you spend thinking about this? And what are your thoughts about it? Do you feel that your optimism completely overshadows your fear?
Well,
Or do
yeah.
you think that you just, are we going to ignore this because it's just so cool? Or
No,
what?
I think
Share
it's
some thoughts.
fantastic question. And I do think it's a very serious issue. China is not waiting on this technology. Russia said it's more important than nuclear weapons. I do feel it's an emergency. We do have to teach our students this technology. If we let only Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon get control of this material, we're going to be in trouble. My mission has been to make sure as many humans know about this material as possible. That's kind of my faith and my hope. You know, when I was thinking about, you know, Rex and Sheridan, they didn't have faith in the future in the abstract sense. They had faith in people. They had faith in the Guilford students and the Guilford community. And I think that's sort of the justification for my optimism, is that it is up to us. And we have to, I think, stay optimistic about it and share that optimism and share the sort of the possibilities that come with the optimistic viewpoint. I think we do run the risk of getting discouraged about it, getting down about it. I think it is going to be something like the internet that's going to have lots of good things and lots of bad things about it. Someone put in here about, you know, privacy and law enforcement. There's some serious issues. You know, just preparing for these pictures, Google image popped up and it had different versions of me with different versions of my hair, and it said, "Is this the same person?" And I was sort of giving it feedback to say, yes, or these are the same person. You know, what does that mean? I think these are the kind of questions we can engage the Guilford students. I think we can bring students to campus to say, we're going to have these dialogues. I think the most important thing is it's no longer sort of limited to mathematicians and physicists in a sense. We need to invite the rest of the broader community, because these are the people who are going to have to think about the policy and the implications and the societal impacts of these technologies. And I think we very much need to have these people, you know, their voices be heard. You know, I'm excited for when the gradient descent converges faster. That's what excites me. You know, when the math works. But there's so many rich pieces about this now, and I think that's the opportunity for a school like Guilford. I really think it's an opportunity. I think that you guys can steal the show with this space. We have a tremendous history that we can claim from it, looking at all this stuff we saw this morning. And I think we can say to students that there's not many places, like Don said, if you go to a big school, you can't get to this material. You can't get to it. You first have to major in computer science, which is going to be years and years of just dry stuff about algorithms and database and operating systems, which doesn't have anything to do with this. And after that, then you're gonna have to go to graduate school and do algorithm analysis and all kinds of good stuff. And I'm not suggesting people don't do that, but we can't, that's not the route for everybody. This is too important. And it's like saying the only people who can make websites are the people who do punch cards or something. You know, we have to just open it up now. So I think that's the safest bet. That's what keeps me optimistic, is the getting all of the wonderful next generation of Guilford students involved. I have no doubt they'll do some great stuff.
All right, let's go to Toph. What's your question?
I thought you were going to take some from the chat first.
It actually got covered in the last question. So.
Oh, okay. I guess it seems to me there are obviously two implications. There's the implication of the computer being really good at doing these things. I wonder if you have any sense that when there are enough effective neurons in the algorithm, will it ever become conscious and have its own desires, or is it always going to be a captive of the mathematical, just running the algorithm and essentially, in other words, is it going to get conscious and decide that it's superior to people, or is it just going to keep running the numbers?
So this is, I think, like sort of the biggest question in the world right now. We've actually formed a working group. I want to invite everybody to join our meetings. I'll send that link around. And we've got some really great, philosophers. We've got the Blums, and we've got Bernie Bars. And we've got some nice sort of philosophers from the theory of consciousness that are excited about joining this group, because that's what we don't know. I got a book from Don years ago about emergence, and that really changed my life. And yeah. I think that's where is it just going to emerge, right? If we have one neuron, if we have one ant, it gets lost. Somewhere around 25 ants, they can start to build a trail. So certainly individual neurons aren't conscious, but when does that happen? I think this is really a very important question. And I think this gets at some interesting stuff. In pursuing that question, it's led me to things like music and language and poetry and all kinds of goofy stuff. Or not so goofy stuff, but I previously had thought it was. And now I'm kind of scratching my head saying, well, wait a minute, what is all of this this other kinds of modalities that we use in our brain. Einstein said if you measure everybody about their ability to climb a tree, you're not going to measure things very well. And so I think we run into that problem with consciousness. What exactly are we conscious of? I'm not conscious of my toes. And if I am conscious of my toes, I'm not conscious of my spleen. And if I am conscious of my spleen now, so we sort of have this little spotlight that we can move around. And, Mark Minsky called him a suitcase word, that we have a lot of features and properties like self-reflection and self-awareness. And are those going to emerge? And which ones will we get? The big questions that people talk about is this alignment problem. If we do get a machine that has a will of its own, what will it be? What kind of a person will it be? Hopefully I would want to be a Guilfordian.
Thank you.
Eve, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. So I'm not a physics alumni, but I was in the computer and economics department. And
real quick, we have a trick question when people come into our lab. We say, what's your major? And no matter what they reply, we say, perfect.
Sounds good. So it's good also to see, I think my advisor, Natalia, was on the call. And I did a thesis on machine learning. And so I worked as a machine learning engineer in the US, and right now I'm in Canada. So kind of my question is kind of twofold. So I don't know if you've heard about the idea of Judea Pearl of the ladder of causation, and that the current machine learning we're doing right now is really about correlations, and we kind of need to move up to like, how do you program interventions into these models, and how now do we go to the third step about counterfactuals? So, and then the second question is, so I'm in a group called Black in AI, and we talk a lot about bias in machine learning, and kind of what do you see that field evolving? And I think Guilford might benefit a lot, because really, if we don't fix bias and we really don't think about bias a lot, we might end up doing a lot of crazy stuff with this technology.
Yeah, fantastic question. It's a great point, because I think this is, largely the opportunity that I think Guilford can bring, because Guilford, I think, has a particularly rich set of experiences and backgrounds in those spaces. And I think we can start having these kinds of discussions. So that's what I kind of was getting at, where it's no longer a technical thing. So as you're mentioning, these things depend on the data. So say for the cats and dogs, which cats and dogs are you picking? Are you only picking the cute cats that are in the middle of the photograph? And so that's going to sort of bias how you're going to choose your data. And I think this is going to be a really, really big issue. And like Don's saying, there's not really any classes that are teaching this to anyone who's outside of a sort of a signal processing engineering kind of a major. But these are exactly the types of questions we need to address in a different format. That's not really a technical question per se, or if it is, it's a different kind of technical question.
If I can just jump in on that one, there was an example that came up in the class I was teaching. I believe it was in Florida, where a court system tried to train an AI to recognize or to estimate the probability that somebody would jump bail. And you can do that. You can take all the input about each case, and you can take all the legal cases and see which people jumped bail and which people showed up at court. But the question they couldn't answer was, is your goal to achieve equal outcomes? In other words, they were looking particularly at race, like because the issue was, that there's racial issues already ingrained into the system. So if you use the system to train the AI, you are just propagating those systems. So are you trying to give each individual person an equal shot, or are you trying to make sure that there is an equal distribution of outcomes? And that's a question the computer can't answer, because you have to decide what you think justice is. Is it just to give everybody the same shot, or is it just to make sure that one group statistically gets the same output as another group?
I have to pile in here from an industry perspective. I spent the last 20 years in the financial services industry, trying to apply machine learning and AI to, financial decisions around, consumers or customers or loan decisions or risk-based decisions. And they, unfortunately, the AI learns the unbelievable systemic racism that's in our country. I mean, the racism is unbelievable in the AI that we've been trying to deploy in loan decisions, mortgage decisions. It's it's a real problem. You know, what it's learning is not the right thing to learn.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest areas is sort of this, transparency and the interpretability of these models. So to go in, so especially in the financial world, as I hinted at before, they were notorious for sort of having these black box models, because when they either approved a loan or not, they didn't have to tell you why, right? They didn't even bother. And that's really because the model had nothing to say. The model is just outputs a 0 or 1. Now we're starting to see a sort of a new field emerge where, you imagine in the future, you're going to have the AI sort of make a guess, but then force it to say, well, now tell me in English why you made that decision. And tell me about the data you have in your data set that leads you to believe that. And then maybe what's the cause and effect structure. So there's some really interesting stuff to look at what's called good old fashioned AI. So
no, but fundamentally, the data is wrong. Fundamentally, the data, the only data you can get is a lifetime of systemic racism.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. I mean, there's no other data you're going to get. You're going to get a lifetime of systemic racism in data and populations and people and what they're doing. There's no other data to get.
So we have to be very careful not to just sort of crystallize the last century in these models.
But amen, brother.
So take a look at, you asked about causation. Take a look at something called argumentation theory, which is sort of a classical version of AI and just the good old fashioned AI, as it's called. I think there's a lot of overlap between, these classic algorithms that did have logic, things like Prolog and predicate calculus, which knows facts and reasons and can think about things, versus these machine learnings are really knee-jerk reactions. You're sort of carefully crafting when a picture hits your kneecap, the thing just kicks and says cat. But it has no ability to deliberate, right? None of these algorithms sort of can really chew on an image and look at it. And I think that's what you need to analyze both sort of these very complicated issues, like is the data set biased, and then to have it sort of force out, well, why does it think this, to get back the cause? Because if it can't justify it with cause and effect, then it's probably not making a good decision.
One great example I love about the limitations of this is if you train the thing to recognize a dog or a cat, and then you give it a picture of a lizard, it will say that's a dog because you have only given it 2 options and it will have to pick one of the 2. And so that's a simple example, but the kind of stuff that Benjamin is talking about is really super complicated, but it's still limited by how you frame the question and what choices you've given it. And I was just teaching a lab this week in my astronomy class where the students were learning how to use machine learning tools. They're going to do a galaxy classification thing next week. But one student had tried to teach the thing to recognize, I think it was a dog, a snake, and a tiger. And, I know what it was. I had done a demonstration with dog breeds between a corgi and a pug dog and a husky. And then I gave it a cartoon, a drawing, not a real dog, but a drawing. And it was a drawing of a husky, but the computer thought it was a pug dog. And the student said, well, what is it about this drawing that the computer thought, I gave it a photograph of a husky and it said that's a husky. I gave it a drawing of a husky and it said that's a pug dog. We could not take the box apart and see why the drawing sent it down the road of pug dog. At best, you could look a bit under the hood and see, well, maybe pug dog got like a 0.72 probability, whereas husky got a 0.71. So it went with pug dog, but it almost got husky. But you can't, it gets so complicated when you're throwing 20 million parameters at a problem. It's hard to take it apart and figure out how it got down that one particular path.
And they're just not intelligent. They just sort of blurt out answers. So we'll have one, I think we'll probably look at tomorrow. You give it a dog, and it's clearly just a picture of a dog, and it reports back that there's a tennis ball.
Yes.
It's just because dogs so often have tennis balls in the data that it can't actually distinguish the concept of dog from tennis ball.
There was a wonderful talk of where AIs go wrong. That is like
the
a
bagel
TED
and
talk.
puppies and
What?
I'm going to try to show that tomorrow. The Sharpei and do you remember the different? There's like there's like a Chihuahua and a muffin and a bagel and a dog. There's a bunch of categories that are really surprising.
The hill with sheep.
Oh man, it might be a different one.
Yeah, but the computer had been trained on images of sheep on hills, but it had never been given an image of a hill with no sheep. And so when it was shown an image of a hill with no sheep, it said sheep on hill. because it had never been trained to recognize the sheep as a different thing from the hill. So yeah, Peter has a question. Go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I'm not on mute. What about, so I follow AI a lot, but more reading about it than actually hands-on. But I'm really curious about your thoughts on the generalized machine learning, which does seem to have the ability to talk about things it hasn't directly learned on.
Yeah, so I think maybe you asked something about the GTP, about which transformer. This was actually GTP2 I ran it on. So it's not even the new one, right?
Okay.
The new one is just outrageous in terms of its
It
ability
really is.
to just like sort of generate fake text.
And images and like
Wow.
code, like people like have a design, they just design a website that has a green buy now button and is selling cars, and it's like, just spits it out.
So now, now sort of website design is available to the graphic design community.
And I was just looking up an article, but I didn't find it. If I can find it, Don, I'll send it to you. But it specifically, I don't think it's is it GPT or GTP? Anyway, they used a generalized AI model that they taught on a couple, I think they taught it about gravity. And it was just doing gravity simulations on development of galaxies in the universe from Big Bang on, or expansion period on. And it started answering questions about fundamental laws of physics that they never taught it on. And they didn't even show it data that included that. And so it made the scientific, and there's a paper on it that was released recently. And so the group of scientists started to think, what is it about gravity that's tied to these other fundamental laws that we don't know? And like we're talking about, they couldn't pull it apart in the black box. So they're sort of like, well, it does this thing and we don't know. But it seemed rather like it was coming up with innovative thoughts.
It's unbelievable. I mean, there's so many sort of different wild examples I wanted to cover. One that just came out about a year ago or so was a group out of France associated with Facebook. And they did symbolic mathematics. So, you think about, if you're familiar with MATLAB versus Maple, Maple has this ability to say, this is X and we don't know what it is. Let's just carry it through as a symbol. And they actually cooked up a whole bunch of problems. They encoded them as text, fed them into the network. And they basically said, what's the integral of this? What's the derivative of that? Factor this, simplify that. And they compared this after they trained it. They compared it to the Wolfram Alpha. And Wolfram Mathematica, rather. And Mathematica is 30 years old. It's $100 million probably put into development. It's got dozens and dozens of professional programmers and mathematicians over decades programming it. It just smoked Wolfram. This neural network just, in one second, it outputs multiple solutions. Yeah. The Wolfram just quits after 30 seconds or something.
And Google's translation system now is a generalized AI, which is fascinating. And it's developed its own language model that they've been able to tease some out, where it can do, it's almost like a universal translator. That's where they're going. It can translate languages that it's never seen before.
I think we're going to get to that. I think we're going to see the translation of uncracked languages, linear A and linear B and all these sort of ancient languages. That
give it 2 years. 2 years.
I think it's whack. I throw out wacky stuff, like we're going to talk to dolphins and stuff, right? It sounds so bananas and baloney, but it's like, no. I have a sort of a joke that I talk about with the
100%
professors that I used to say within 10 years or 15 years, but now I think it's probably much, much closer. When you get to the end of a show that you like in Netflix, Amazon, whatever, there's going to be a button that says, make me another one. And when you watch the very last Star Trek Next Generation, you say, I want another season, please. You hit that button. It is going to make you another season.
Firefly.
I used to think this was 10 years away. I think this is like 5 years away.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, with deep fakes.
More Firefly, please.
Yeah.
Again?
In the interest of time, I think let's have one more question and then let Will go. If we were in person, I wish we could all go down to the microbrewery and have a beer and keep talking about this. But let's have one more question. And Charles Womack asked one in the chat here. AI uses numerical models, but the human mind is conceptual, using estimates for numerical values. Do you think AI will be able to work conceptually to solve problems?
Absolutely. And that was sort of this big breakthrough. Look up, I think it's called, if you just type in symbolic mathematics, deep learning, I'll post the link. But this is exactly what they've done. They've sort of figured out how to encode as a pattern and say, this is X, this is Y, this is Z. and it can actually carry them through as symbols. I think what's really exciting is how do we give it the concept of energy and entropy and force and momentum and stability and these kinds of concepts. I think that would be really, really fascinating, but we're probably not that far away yet. I would encourage all the students, there's some really cool stuff you can do. Just do some physics experiments in the lab and then capture them. Can the AI predict the second half of the experiment, right? So imagine you're capturing it on video. You give the first 10 minutes of the frames, say you're growing a crystal, right? Say you're growing rock candy or something, right? So you point your camera at this rock candy crystal it's growing and you watch it grow. Can the AI learn to fake that crystalline pattern? You pause the video and say, please draw me the next 10 frames of this crystal growth. You have the 10 frames because you recorded the video. And now you can force the neural network to learn crystal growth.
All right. Well, thank you so much for a challenging and thought-provoking talk, Will. Let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you all so very much. It was a tremendous honor. We're going to be continuing this fun discussion tomorrow at 10, and we'll do some hands-on stuff. So certainly encourage everybody to join us then. Thank you again so much, everybody. Tremendous honor.